Yesterday, the Supreme Court struck down a Republican-drawn congressional voting map that would have watered down the black vote. In a 5-4 ruling, the justices mandated the state legislature to draw a second district that gives black voters the opportunity to elect representatives of their choice.
Conservative Justices Roberts and Kavanaugh joined the 3 liberal justices in handing down what is being categorized as a big win for the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In the decision, Roberts wrote, quote, "Our opinion today does not diminish or disregard these concerns. It simply holds that a faithful application of our precedents and a fair reading of the record before us do not bear them out here." Alabama state lawmakers will now have to go back to the drawing board.
As they should. When I look at the congressional maps in Alabama, I think about 27% of the state's population being made up by people who are black. And I look at these districts, it's so obviously gerrymandered. So you have Birmingham and Montgomery in the middle of the state, and then you have a district that is southwest of those 2 cities. That is where the majority of the black population is, and they have a huge cutout for Congressional District 7. That is the one that is the main concern. It is the only majority black district in the state, despite nearly 30% of the state being black. So there are a lot of much smaller districts that are cut that are not majority black. And so what they've done here is effectively, yes, given the black population 1 vote for a representative here. They have 7 districts, only 1 of them being majority black. I think this is a fair ruling because I believe this gerrymandering was a clear effort to dilute the black vote in the state of Alabama. And it was drawn by folks that are not representative of the population. When you have gerrymandering that is done for the explicit purpose to dilute people on the basis of race, that is a situation where I think the Supreme Court should absolutely strike down that map and say you cannot do that. That is protected under the United States Constitution. That's discrimination.
I was kind of surprised by the court's ruling on this, especially with Kavanaugh joining the majority. He's typically seen as a more conservative justice, but they've surprised us before. I mean, Gorsuch voting, for example, to make gender identity a protected category under discrimination law was something that surprised conservatives as well. In this case, I wonder, was the map drawn with the intent of discriminating based on race, or if they were doing this for political purposes? Because we see gerrymandering all across the country that is drawn in an attempt to not dilute based on race, but to dilute based on political proclivities of the districts that are voting. So that would be the distinction that I'm curious about here. You're obviously more up on the case than I am.
Yeah, listening to the oral arguments, it really does seem to be that this was a decision made about the discrimination based on race, right? So I don't think we could take this ruling and use it as precedent for, well, you drew these districts so that Democrats would win, for example. I mean, we saw all kinds of gerrymandering in New York State, and that was along party lines rather than, identity. Race is protected under the Civil Rights Act of 1965. And so I think that's why we had this ruling here. It seems to me that the oral arguments were very specific to that and how the law applies here and how Section 2 may or may not apply. Of course, we had Clarence Thomas write the dissent in this case and say that he doesn't believe the law would apply in this scenario, which is just rich coming from Clarence Thomas, but it's about what I would expect. I actually did think that the court would rule the other way, and that it would be a 5-4 decision to actually uphold this map, which would have consequences where you might have state legislators be more bold about their gerrymandering, especially across racial lines, knowing that there's this precedent. So this is a surprise from the Roberts Court and what we've seen.
Yeah, definitely, and especially considering the way that they voted in the Brnovich, Arizona case, although that was slightly different because in that case it was the DNC that was suing, alleging that some of the voter integrity measures that Arizona had put in place, namely the idea that you can't cast a vote in the wrong precinct and still have it be counted, was tantamount to racial discrimination. Obviously, that argument didn't hold up in front of the Supreme Court. So that kind of tips the hat, I think, to the idea that this was perhaps a more blatant attempt to perhaps undermine the black vote.
Right. And I would be shocked to see this ruling used as a precedent for, okay, this is a state where the population's 27% black. Statistically speaking, if you have 7 districts, they should have 2. Maybe 3, but 2 for sure. And so they instructed them, it seems, to go back and redraw the districts, but at least 2 need to be majority black, given what the population makeup of this state is and the concentration of the black population in this state. That's a very specific recommendation to make for a state legislator. There are concerns about should it be the job of the Supreme Court or the federal judiciary to draw congressional maps. No, surely not. They have to go back and decide that for themselves and draw it. Would this be used to say every state population needs to have maps that are proportionate to the racial makeup of the state? I don't think we can expect to see this ruling applied that way. There is a conversation about it, and that's an interesting one. Yeah, certainly. I mean, I could see the opposite argument being made, for example, that white voters or Asian voters are being underrepresented in congressional districts. For example, if a rural area were lumped in with an urban area that had a higher black population, would it be argued potentially that the rural voters by nature of being more white or even more Latino compared to the urban area, would their voices be considered not proportional to their ability to elect representatives? Yeah, I think that is interesting. I think this is such an extreme scenario, and that's why the court ruled this way, is that it was that obvious. And maybe if we heard another case like the one you described, which is a common problem with gerrymandering, where they're cutting out a proportion of an urban area, adding in the rural area, typically we see the racial lines falling where we have majority white rural areas, majority black urban areas in states. Could you make the argument that this was racial dilution in that case as well? I don't know if we'd see the court rule the same way if a case like that was heard by them. I could see that being something brought up by Stephen Miller's organization, America First Legal. I mean, that's the kind of thing that they've been doing. And I'm from Maryland, the 6th District, which has been sort of historically lumped in. Western Maryland has been lumped in with Montgomery County, which is a DC suburb and trends very, very Democrat, whereas Western Maryland is very, very conservative. And it's one of the reasons why for a very long time, Maryland, despite having a pretty heavy conservative population in both the western and on the western side and on the eastern shore, has only had one Republican congressman. And the 6th District was recently redrawn in a way that made it slightly more favorable to conservatives, but still has Garrett County and Frederick County in with Montgomery County, making it incredibly difficult for those voters to elect a Republican. So I'm just against gerrymandering in all forms, and I hope we can get rid of it over the next few years. But the Supreme Court has been so reticent to really do much about it until, I guess, now. So we'll see what happens. Yeah, I'd be interested to see more gerrymandering cases of different nature than just this very clear-cut racial case, because it's very obvious what they're doing with the gerrymandering to maintain power. All right, we've got more Rising after this.